Hello, I'm Dr. Dafydd Daniel, MacDonald Lecturer in Christian Ethics at the Faculty of Theology and Religion, and it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you today on this question: should faith be optimistic or pessimistic? And really to answer this question, or to explore answers to it, we have to go back, as with most things I tend to think, into the 18th century, and more specifically back to the 1st of November 1755 and the Great Lisbon Earthquake. And this earthquake, the Lisbon earthquake, remains the most powerful earthquake, followed by a tsunami, to ever strike continental Europe, leading to great loss of life, not just in Lisbon, but across Europe and even into the coast of West Africa. But the consequences of this earthquake were not just physical. They were also philosophical, theological, and ethical. And that's why it's of interest to us, particularly as it affected the thought of this man, the French philosopher Voltaire. Now, Voltaire was living in Geneva when he first had news of the Lisbon earthquake. He'd been banished there as a result of some of his radical writings, as well as personal indiscretions. And when he heard about the earthquake and the devastation, destruction, loss of life that he caused, it in turn caused Voltaire to doubt. And what he came to doubt was his optimism. And when I say that Voltaire became less optimistic as a result of this earthquake, I mean that literally, in the sense that the word optimism was first coined in 1737 by French Jesuits, in fact, and it was coined then to describe the philosophy of this man, with his very impressive wig there, and this is the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. And it was Leibniz's philosophy, his optimism, that Voltaire came to doubt as a result of the Lisbon disaster. In fact, he thought that the Lisbon earthquake entirely disproved Leibniz's position. So what is Leibniz's position? Well, his thought basically suggests that disasters like the Lisbon earthquake were in effect not really disasters, and certainly not something that we should properly call evil. So, of course, things like earthquakes and plagues, something that's on our mind a lot today, hurricanes, other sort of natural events, they bring destruction and loss of life. That's undeniable. But at the same time, you might cite, if you're a Leibnizian optimist, that old adage, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And so just as that omelette that you create out of all those broken eggs makes all of that brokenness worthwhile, we just have to believe, to trust optimistically that all this destruction in the world wrought by natural disasters is necessary for some reason, even if we don't know what that reason is. So crucial then to this Leibnizian optimism is not just the belief that God exists, but that God possesses those conventional attributes you may have come across before. So God is all-knowing, omniscient, or powerful, omnipotent, or loving, omnibenevolent. This is God's being. And so once we have that belief in God, we have a belief that God is, in effect, the best of all possible gods. And because God is the best of all possible gods, we can trust optimistically that God will create what Leibniz calls the best of all possible worlds. As he puts it there, because this supreme wisdom, right, omniscience, united with goodness, right, omnibenevolence, could not fail to choose what is best. So what we have from Leibniz is an approach that an optimist has to the problem of evil. So what is that problem? Well, as you may remember, it's to do with what's sometimes called an inconsistent triad. The clue there by this triangle I've got here. So on the one hand, we've got God is all-powerful, omnipotent. Okay, well, God is also omnibenevolent. Those two things seem to be inconsistent with the fact that evil exists. And this is a modern problem in philosophy in the sense that we associate with the Enlightenment era onwards, 18th century onwards, but it is an old discussion. Here we have St. Augustine, one of the early church fathers, African saint, and Augustine put the problem quite succinctly. Either God cannot abolish evil or he will not. If he can't do it, then he's not all-powerful. If he refuses to do it, then he's not all good. So the optimist has a response to this problem, And here's one. Here's the English poet Alexander Pope. And Pope gives us his own poetic answer. So, all nature is art unknown to thee, all chance direction which thou can't see. One truth is clear, whatever is right. So, in other words, it looks like an accident to us, right? Nature looks it's full of disaster. It doesn't look artistic. It looks like a mess. But that's only because we don't have a God's eye view of it. God knows that nature is artistic. God sees that it's not about chance or randomness. It's actually direction, because he has designed it. And everything that happens is following divine providence, even if it doesn't appear like that to human beings at the moment. So through optimistic faith in God, we can say optimistically that whatever happens is right, even if it doesn't look that way to us. Now, Voltaire, when he heard about the Lisbon disaster, came to think that the optimism put forward by Leibniz and also by Pope — Voltaire is explicitly rejecting both Pope and Leibniz in his writings — he thought that optimism became ridiculous and offensive. And he made these points clear in two works in particular. One is a poem that he wrote in 1756, immediately after the disaster, a poem on the Lisbon disaster. And the other one is his better-known work, the satire Candide, in 1759. So let's start with Candide. Well, we can see already that Candide may have some relevance as a piece of literature with the debate about optimism, because its subtitle is Or Optimism. And what we have in Candide is the story of this young man travelling the world with his philosopher, patron Pangloss. And it just so happens that Candide and Pangloss arrive in Lisbon as the Lisbon disaster hits, as the earthquake strikes. And when this earthquake arrives, Pangloss tries to console the people around him in the midst of this destruction. And how does he do it? Well, he thinks he is being reassuring by telling them that things couldn't be otherwise than they are. Right? So all is the best there could be. Right? That sort of Leibnizian view. If there's a volcano under Lisbon, part of one of the theories of the earthquake at the time was that a volcano had erupted under the sea, bringing about the earthquake and the tsunami. Well, if that earthquake is there and it's caused if this volcano is there and it's caused this earthquake, we know that God must have put it there. And because God has put it there, we can trust in the line of Pope there, all is well. So it seems like a disaster, it seems painful, but actually all is well. There must be some reason for this, even if we can't see it at the moment. Candide, alongside Pangloss, during the earthquake, has a different reaction. He is shocked and bewildered, taken aback, covered in blood, shaking all over, and says, well, if this is the best of all possible worlds, what on earth are the others like? So very clearly there, Voltaire giving us his satirical, comic response to Leibnizian best of all possible worlds, where Pangloss is this stooge for Leibniz's optimism. But the other thing to take out of this statement and reaction of Candide is Voltaire's wider point that, first of all, to react as Candide does here is more human than Pangloss's reaction. To be taken aback and bewildered by suffering is to be confronted by it as evil, as suffering, by human pain around us, not to literally gloss it over, as Pangloss is trying to do. It's also then more profound because of that. We are meant to be bewildered by this question of evil, of suffering from Voltaire, and we're not only to take it as a fundamental question of life, but actually one that might be unanswerable. So again, we can't just gloss over it, dismiss it, as the optimist tries to do. These essential points from Candide, Voltaire had also made in his original poem, Lisbon Disaster. And this is from the preface to the poem that he wrote. So again, you see him say, the question of physical evil, of natural evil, deserves the attention of all human beings. It must arrest our attention, grab our attention. It calls us to the contemplation of our feeble nature, these events like plagues and earthquakes that cause this suffering. And in the poem itself, he has it, Leibniz can't tell me from what secret cause, in a world governed by the wisest laws, lasting disorders, woes that never end, with our vain pleasures, real sufferings blend. So in other words, Leibniz just can't really explain this problem of evil. He thinks he can with this elaborate optimistic system that Pangloss had. Everything that happens for a reason, but it can't really explain what's going on in the world. But not only can it not explain it, it's clearly a ridiculous response, right? Whatever is right, that line of Pope. Well, the universe confutes that whole idea, right? O wretched man, earth fated to be cursed, abyss of plagues and miseries the worst, horrors and horrors, griefs on griefs must show that man's the victim of unceasing woe. So it's no good just to dismiss the problem of evil. It fails to take it seriously. And in fact, then it minimizes the suffering that we all face, the shared suffering under the fact of death that all confronts us, but also at these moments of natural disasters that disproportionately affect certain people. We have to really come to grips with the fact that is something wretched, as Voltaire puts it there. There's also a further point to Voltaire's view here, that not only does the optimist reaction end up minimizing suffering that people have to face in life, but it ends up minimizing the significance of the individual. So what he's getting at here is that Leibniz's view of what he calls the principle of sufficient reason, that everything that happens for a reason, it's planned by God, divine providence. In Leibnizian language, this makes the world into a machine. Right, it's all ordered, it's all planned, everything happens for a purpose, right? It's a well-oiled machine. But you can see Voltaire saying here, well, if all these miseries we're confronted in the here and now as individuals are not really very significant, we shouldn't be concerned about them, because individuals and their pain is nothing but tiny cogs in a great machine, then that actually ends up meaning that individuals are not precious or important in the eyes of God. So something that actually undermines the idea of personal creation, but personal relationship, value in the individual, that Christian philosophers like Leibniz wanted to emphasize. Okay, so what is Voltaire's answer to this problem then, the problem of evil? Well, rather than optimism, he prefers pessimism. And this pessimism is to say that, well, we are atoms tormented on this earthly ball, the sport of fate, by death soon swallowed all. The sport of fate, things do happen by random, by chance. We can't just say it's all planned and designed that way. And that soon we'll all face death. That is suffering, that is evil, it's unavoidable. But there's a further aspect to this pessimism. And it's along these lines for Candide. I mean, Candide ends with the whole satire, the book ends with this enigmatic phrase, we must tend to our garden. It seems that part of what Voltaire is saying is that to be like Pangloss, like Leibniz, to get drawn into this elaborate philosophizing, making these optimistic structures, really cheats the problem of evil and fails to lead us to sort of be confronted by it, to do something about it. To tend to our garden is to accept what we can't explain. So we can't explain natural evil. We can't do anything about that. We can't do anything to explain it. We also can't do anything to solve it in the end. The fact is we all will die. Once we accept that human agency can't overcome natural evil, we can start to take responsibility for the evil that we can deal with, and that's human evil, suffering in society. And so that's our garden, not the injustice of the universe itself, the injustice of death, but social injustice. And that was something that Voltaire dedicated his life and his writings to oppose, injustices in human society. Well, Voltaire's work, his poem, came to the attention of another great French Enlightenment philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it came to Rousseau's attention because Voltaire sent it to him. So that's always a good approach there. Now, Rousseau wrote a letter to Voltaire to explain his disagreement with him, and as it's a private letter published without Rousseau's permission, it doesn't have a title. It's often referred to as a letter on Providence. And we can see in this letter, these are quotations from it, that Rousseau has tasked himself with defending optimism from Voltaire's pessimism. And when I say that Rousseau is defending optimism against Voltaire's pessimism, I again mean that literally, because the word pessimism was coined to describe Voltaire's position in Candide. So this is Rousseau rejecting this pessimistic outlook. And what he says is that actually he finds pessimism cruel, and he prefers Pope and Leibniz's optimism. This idea, your ills are a necessary consequence of the design of the universe, that's what an optimist says. And that's a better way of looking at the world. If he has not made a better universe, it's because he could not. Now, there, what Rousseau is doing is playing with the term best of all possible worlds. Remember that for Voltaire, that it seemed to suggest that there can't be any real evil in the world. We have to say that suffering just isn't evil when it's caused by natural disasters, because actually it serves a purpose. Well, Rousseau is trying to say something different, that the phrase best of all possible worlds doesn't mean that everything that happens for the best. It simply means that the world is the best that it could be. Okay? And this is what he then clearly states in his letter. If evil requires that you vary one of God's perfect qualities, why defend his power at the expense of his goodness? Why say that God is omnipotent when we also want to say he's omnibenevolent? If we must choose between two untruths, I prefer the opposite choice. In other words, Rousseau is fairly happy to say that God is just not all-powerful. He was constrained in the type of world that he could create. It was the best of a good job that he could do. In such a world, there are going to be imperfections. There's also another aspect to Rousseau's response, and this is what we call really the first example of the sociology of disaster. Okay, Rousseau, and this is still in his letter to Voltaire, is saying that most of the evils that we experience, even the natural evils, are of our own making. Right, so moral evil, very clear. Right, human free will. We introduce moral evil into the world. It seems counterintuitive to say that we introduce physical evil in the world, because that's to do with these random events, earthquakes, plagues, and so on. Well, Voltaire's point is different. As he points out to Voltaire, right, let's stay with the question of Lisbon. It was not nature that piled up there 20,000 houses, right, in the floodplains of Lisbon. Right? How many poor creatures died because someone ran back into their house to get their belongings, right? To get their clothes, to get their money, so on. So, in other words, human beings might not have created the winds and the ruptures in the earth that bring about the disaster, but the way that we react to it certainly aggravates the suffering and creates greater evil. And if we lived in a different relationship with nature, if we built our houses in concert with nature, then there wouldn't be so many human beings exposed to a disaster like Lisbon. Also, Rousseau points out that Voltaire has said in his letter that if the world is designed optimistically, right, that Leibnizian faith, then surely God would have organized the world so that the earthquake would have only happened in a desert, and so then no human beings will have been harmed. Well, this proves or adds to Rousseau's point about the sociology of disaster. It's human beings, we decide what is a disaster, right? We decide. It's not a realist term, right? We decide what is disastrous. And so we're not going to call an earthquake in a desert disaster simply because there's no human beings there to suffer it. But even more important there, you see Rousseau adds there, because there's no city dwellers there. So again, this is part of Rousseau's point that what human beings call a disaster is not just things that affect human beings rather than nature or rather than animals, but we also tend to call things disasters only things which affect the elite in human Western society. That's what makes a disaster. And so Rousseau wants to say if we give up our obsessions with European elitism, if we give up our human centricity as well, then more and more things will cease to be disastrous, and that there won't be such causes of suffering. So going back to the optimism of Pope and Leibniz, he does find some comfort in the fact that there's a great machine, a great system, which means that a disaster on Earth, it's disastrous for people on Earth, for some of the people on Earth, but maybe that disaster on Earth actually helps to keep, as he puts it there, the majority of the inhabitants of Saturn in comfort. Maybe it's the case at the end there, this quotation that we live and we die and our life is short. But actually, maybe it's the fact that process of death and returning into the soil as a process of the cycle, right? The circle of life, sort of Elton John type theme here. So life enables more and more human beings to be born. And so actually our sufferings of individuals, including our death, does contribute to the good of all in the long run. And that's something that Rousseau finds consoling. So we have there this problem of optimism and pessimism, and what faith should look like. And it seems that we have these different answers from Voltaire. So Voltaire wants to point out problems with an optimistic faith. That we have to say with him that evil is loose on the earth, saying all is well is nothing but an insult to the sufferings of our lives. An optimistic faith just ignores suffering, it tries to minimize it, and it doesn't really take it seriously as a question. Rousseau wants to say something different, wants to defend optimistic faith and to decry pessimism. If it isn't always an evil to die, still it is rarely, very rarely, an evil to have to live. In other words, that the pessimist focuses too much on the fact that life isn't perfect, and because life isn't perfect, it wants to say that any existence at all is something that's evil, whereas Rousseau thinks the optimist, remember him rejecting that naive optimism that's saying everything is for the best. Well, in the type of world that we have, which is imperfect, let's just celebrate what is good, even if imperfect, about it. Okay. Well, you might have noticed that this question that I put for this lecture, should faith be optimistic or pessimistic, also invites a further question. Well, faith in what? Is it faith in God or something else, like faith in human beings? And when we think of it like that, we can see that Voltaire's pessimistic faith in God actually becomes an optimistic faith in human progress through human civilization. And you see this, for example, in an much earlier poem by Voltaire, translated as The Worldling, where worldliness is celebrated as something providential. So there's something about increased luxury, capitalism, trade, growing wealth across European society, leading to an increase of learning. And why is that good for Voltaire? Well, one thing is that he wants to defend global trade capitalism as something that creates conversation between different groups of peoples, right, near and far, that would otherwise not meet. And so you see he said that, look at the London Stock Exchange. You'll see gathered together there people of different races and creeds that would normally be mortal enemies, but now they're joined together around a shared project of making money for the utility of humankind. It's certainly a certain cynicism there in Voltaire, a sort of wry remark, but at the same time you can see his point that this idea of trade, capitalism, gathers people together, unites them in something, separates them into a global outlook from things that Voltaire would view as tribal and divisive, like religion and culture and country, that keep us trapped apart. And so there he has this view that reason and industry will progress more and more, right? Philosophy will advance and thought will advance. And again, that can go together with an increase in trade, right? A spread of learning, of literature and the arts and the sciences across the world. Not only do they help to fuel trade, but ideas are shared then on a global basis. And that helps us to have a more universalistic, tolerant attitude, right? We start to celebrate the ideas of justice and fairness and truth and honesty when we have a more global perspective. Rousseau has the contrary view, and his optimistic faith in God is actually a pessimistic faith, pessimism about the idea that human beings can progress through civilization. And this leads to his radical, controversial discourse on arts and sciences, 1750, where he wants to point out, direct opposition to Voltaire, that Voltaire wants to celebrate luxury, right? This drive towards refinement, manners, capitalistic outlook as something which is civilizing of the world. Well, actually, Rousseau says that it corrupts us, right? Increased learning is corrupting, luxury is corrupting. And instead he looks back to this happy ignorance of the savage in what he calls a savage in a primitive state. His idea there being really that a celebration of Sparta and what's sometimes called a classical republican outlook, that we don't celebrate cosmopolitanism but patriotism, a love of localism, of place, small place. And why do we do that? Well, because we can have the greatest form of happiness for Voltaire that is possible for human beings, which is a form of self-love that finds its expression through love of family, of one's own family, and the fact that families are then knitted together quite loosely in societies like Sparta or the nation state of France. This will become particularly important for the French revolutionaries when they remodel France and say that they're following Rousseau in doing that. But you can see there, Voltaire in 1755, this is a letter before the Lisbon earthquake, is objecting to Rousseau's outlook. As he puts it there, never has he read a book which has employed so much intellect to persuade men to be beasts. It's against the human race. So that contrary view, Voltaire believing in progress, Western civilization and learning, and Rousseau saying, no, we must return back to nature, to a more primitive state. So where can we go with our question? Well, there's, as you can tell, lots of different directions we can now go in. So let's think about one shared theme, one shared conclusion that might emerge out of this really profound disagreement between Rousseau and Voltaire. One thing that I would say seems to come out of it is that both Rousseau and Voltaire are pointing us toward the dangers of naive and optimistic faith, whether it's in human beings or it's in God. I mean, here we've got this idea that to say that we can just naively believe that human beings can solve all the problems in the world, moral evil and natural evil, that human science and arts will progress to the state that we can just sort of eliminate them entirely from the world, that is unrealistic. And it's just as unrealistic as saying that God will solve everything, or that everything that happens for the best. And not only is it unrealistic, it's self-defeating. That idea of simply saying all is well stops human beings from looking at life properly, from taking responsibility for our action, and instead our attitude collapses into passivity. We put ourselves into a fatalism and complacency, whether we believe human beings can solve everything or whether we believe that God can solve everything.